Okay, so over the years, during lectures and discussions, the question of the binding of Satan has come up many, many times. And I usually deal with that in class or as we're walking through Revelation. But the question comes up, what is the amillennial interpretation of the binding of Satan versus the premillennial interpretation? And how is it that Satan can be thought of as bound in an amillennial perspective? If the binding of Satan is occurring today, right now, what does that actually look like, and how does that fit the symbolism, and what is the best way to take that, and how do premillennialists respond to that? So I want to be, of course, fair to all positions here, but obviously I'm presenting the premillennial position. So this brief kind of recorded lecture is going to be supplementing the millennialism lecture that you have online. So the passage itself, the opening of Revelation 21 through 3, the vision, it says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand." Verse 2, "And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him." And I do put in parentheses here the Greek term that is used, deo, to bind. "Bound him for 1,000 years, and he threw Balo," cast him out, "into the abyss, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed." And notice it is until the completion of the 1,000 years. Notice it is a duration of time during which he is bound until the end of that period. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So first of all, I want to present to you just a snippet, a couple of views of the amillennial interpretation of this text. The amillennial interpretation, I'm going to give you from Anthony Hoekema, a fairly good representative of amillennialism. One of them is as follows. He says, "What is meant now by the binding of Satan? In the Old Testament times, all the nations of the world, except Israel, were, so to speak, under Satan's rule. At that time, the people of Israel were the recipients of God's special revelation, so that they knew God's truth about themselves, about their sinfulness, and about the way they could obtain forgiveness for their sins. During this same time, however, the other nations of the world did not know that truth, except for an occasional person, family, or city, which came into contact with God's special revelation. One could say that during this time, these nations were deceived by Satan, as our first parents had been deceived by Satan when they fell into the sin in the Garden of Eden. We conclude then that the binding of Satan during the gospel age means that first, he cannot prevent the spread of the gospel, and second, he cannot gather all the enemies of Christ together to attack the church." So there you have one of the amillennial interpretations, that Satan being bound is in a it's not in a comprehensive and exhaustive sense that he's bound. That is totally ineffectual, but in a limited sense, limited to the deception of the nations, allowing therefore the gospel to go forth from Israel into the nations, and also preventing him from completely attacking the church in the end times. So the binding of Satan in this interpretation of Hoekema is somewhat limited and specified to certain activities of Satan. Another interpretation of this by an amillennialist, Lenski, says the binding of Satan means that he shall not prevent this heralding of the gospel to all the nations. Very similar. Once the nations were without this heralding, this proclamation, all were under the deception of Satan. One nation alone had the word. Then came Christ and his command, having gone into all the world, herald the gospel to every creature. Where was Satan to stop it? The strong symbolism of being bound with a great chain and thrown into the abyss reveals how mighty was the foe who, above all else, intended to stop this heralding, and what was required to stop him, and how thoroughly he was stopped. Is the imagery too strong for you? Perhaps the Lord who uses it in this vision knows the dragon better than you do, seeing that he conquered him on the cross at the cost of his own life. And so this anticipates the counter-argument by premillennialists saying, look, amillennialism says the binding of Satan is just limited to his deception of the nations and the preventing of the going forth of the gospel. And so it's in a limited, very specific sense. And then you look at the imagery seems fairly final. It seems fairly dramatic, a huge chain, and he's bound and cast into the abyss of all places and sealed over. That seems to be absolute binding from all activity in the earthly sphere, not limited to just the prevention of the gospel going forth. And Lenski says, well, the strength of the symbolism is to match the strength of the adversary. And so I guess you could go with that. And both of them, are drawing on, to some degree, the idea that the Old Testament people, the nations during the Old Testament, were bound under the deception of Satan. Another amillennial interpretation by Henry Spence, it says, the 1,000 years binding and the loosing for a little time describe two events which occur contemporaneously. So this one it's an already. So he's both bound and loosed. So listen carefully. This is a little bit unique. While the godly need have no fear, because even in this world, Satan's power as regards them is completely limited by Christ's act of redemption. So for Christians, Satan is bound, definitively, totally. And that's what that imagery would indicate. But then he says, yet in another sense, as regards the ungodly, Satan is loosed and obtains power over them. So for the rest of the people who are not in the church, Satan has free reign and can deceive them, etc., etc. The chief difficulty in this interpretation lies in the words after this, which is why I pointed that out. The Greek text clearly says, after his binding, he will be loosed for a while. He says, but it must be remembered that the 1,000 years do not express a period of time, but the quality of completeness. Therefore, the loosing of Satan must not be supposed to take place in a period subsequent to the period of the binding. But notice this is actually, I hate to say this, but this is assuming that which must be true, must be proved. So we are looking at the text and saying, look, it says he's bound during this duration until then he is released. You're saying, Spence, that the binding and the loosing are simultaneous. So it makes no sense exegetically that for John to say you're bound until, if it's actually not until, it's simultaneous. And he says, well, the 1,000-year period is symbolic and merely a symbol for completeness anyway. Well, it's not if you take the until seriously. You see, you're, in a sense, I think this is a bit wagging the dog. It's assuming that which must be proved in order to prove that which is in question. So, but in any case, so the premillennial interpretation. So you saw a few millennial interpretations. Now the premillennial interpretation is fairly straightforward. And I'm going to quote Grant Osborne on this. He says, the amillennial position takes us as a description of the church age, saying that Satan is restricted from stopping the missionary enterprise of God's people. And then Osborne says, but I maintain that the language of binding here is much stronger than this. It says here that Satan will not be able to deceive the nations, yet that is exactly what he does in this present age. During the time of the millennial reign, Satan will not be present and will be kept from deceiving the nations. In this present age, he is only restricted with respect to believers. He has full control over the unbelieving nations. He, quote, blinds their minds, traps them, and devours them. In Revelation 21 through 10, he does not deceive anyone until the period is ended. Therefore, this is not the partial binding of the present age, but the full binding of a future period after Christ returns. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the reason why, exegetically, the imagery, the language, why this really needs to be taken as a definitive, complete binding of Satan in the abyss, unable to affect anything on earth during this period of time. And because, therefore, he is deceiving people and on the prowl today, it can't be happening today, and therefore the millennium cannot be a present reality. And in order to understand this, you have to take a look at the language and imagery of some intertestamental literature, this book called First Enoch. The language and imagery is striking, and it needs to inform our understanding of what is going on in Revelation chapter 20. So the background imagery here of First Enoch, this is from First Enoch 10, 4 through 5, which we know for a fact New Testament authors are aware of. It's extremely popular in first century Judea. And we know for a fact New Testament authors were familiar with it because they use imagery from it and, in fact, quote from it in the New Testament. So we know it's not some obscure writing that doesn't influence the language and imagery. So here it is, a scene. This is regarding Raphael and then a demon, Azazel. So again, the Lord said to Raphael, bind, notice the word deo, same exact word used in Revelation chapter 20, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudael, and cast, Balo, him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness and let him abide there forever and cover his face that he may not see light. So the binding and casting into this darkness of this demon by an angel is an image already familiar to first century readers. Then 1 Enoch 10, 11 through 12, and the Lord said unto Michael, go, bind Deo, Samyaza, and his associates. This is, again, an angel, Michael, binding demons. Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth till the day of their judgment and of their consummation. And notice there's the until phrase, until the days of their judgment, until the day of the what? The completion or the consummation. Very, very similar language and imagery as Revelation chapter 20. Going on to 1 Enoch 54. For whom are these chains being prepared? And he said unto me, these are being prepared for the hosts of Azazel, the demons, so that they may take them and cast them into the abyss of complete condemnation, that the Lord of spirits may take vengeance on them for their unrighteousness in becoming subject to Satan and leading astray those who dwell on the earth. And so what this is describing is the post-flood period during which the demons that had been active and caused such wickedness on the earth, they are bound and cast into the abyss. And this is what 2 Peter and Jude actually quote from and refer to when they're talking about this angels that sinned prior to the flood and were cast into Tartarus, into the pits of darkness. It's referring to this account. And so when you get to Revelation chapter 20, this is not new language and imagery. This is language and imagery that anybody in the first century Judea would have been familiar with. So some conclusions. In every case, those demonic spirits being bound and imprisoned in First Enoch are utterly incapable of any influence on the earth. Second, thus, the language and imagery of the binding of Satan in Revelation 21 through 3 draws from a well-established apocalyptic idiom representing complete impotence of those who are bound. The imagery that John uses, that God uses in that vision, the language and the imagery would communicate complete inability to affect things on the earth. Our interpretation of Revelation 21 through 3 must match the symbols as they would have been understood in their first century context. That's part of the historical grammatical interpretation of Scripture. The authors and the readers would have understood this language and imagery in a certain way. That's what we should strive to, that's how we should strive to understand it. Next point, in no way would first century Jewish or Christian readers familiar with Enochian imagery conclude that Revelation 21 through 3 pictured anything other than total incapacity and utter removal from the inhabited creation. So therefore, because of the clear imagery from First Enoch, Revelation 21 through 3 awaits a future fulfillment. Why? Because Satan and his host are not in fact bound completely and incapable of exercising deception and oppression and possession in the world today. Had they been bound, as the imagery of First Enoch indicates and is reflected in Revelation 20, there would be no demonic or satanic activity in the world today. So therefore, even though we will say, because of Christ's work on the cross, because of the redeemed community living in the world, because of the prayers of the saints, because of spiritual warfare going on right now, Satan is definitely restrained today. And in fact, as regards the church, those who are in communion with the church and in fellowship with the church, we are protected from Satan's wiles, and he is in a sense on a leash and unable to attack us as he would want to. Those things are absolutely true. But as far as the binding described in Revelation 20, drawing on Enochian language, that awaits a future period, and it will be a period during which Satan is completely bound. And then that until must be taken seriously. The binding of Satan during the future period has an until. At the end of that, he will be released for a short time. So that's the premillennial versus the amillennial interpretations of Revelation 20. I think the amillennial position fails in that it does not adequately account, number one, for the strength and severity and drama of the image, but more importantly, it doesn't account for the actual language and imagery as it would have been understood at the time because of the very, very popular Enochian language, the accounts of the binding of the demons after the flood and their utter inability to affect anything on this world. So there you have it, the premillennial interpretation of the binding of Satan.